Some mornings change everything and you never see them coming. Rebecca Torres had walked these mountain trails for 20 years, finding peace in the quiet rhythm of her footsteps and her dog's steady breathing beside her. The 39-year-old woman thought she knew every corner of the Idaho wilderness around her cabin. Her German Shepherd Scout was her faithful companion on these dawn walks. But today, something massive blocked their path. A deer stood motionless ahead of them, bigger than any she'd ever seen, with antlers that seemed to touch the sky. Scout started growling, a deep sound she'd never heard from him before. Then Rebecca noticed the wound along the creature's side, a gaping opening that revealed something impossible. What she saw inside would change everything she thought she knew about these mountains. But what happens when the forest's oldest secrets refuse to stay buried? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Rebecca Torres stood frozen on the narrow mountain trail, her weathered hand gripping the carved wooden walking stick that had belonged to her late husband Thomas. 23 years of marriage, 5 years of widowhood, and 2 decades of calling these Idaho mountains home had taught her to read the wilderness like others read newspapers. Every bird call, every rustle of leaves, every shift in the wind carried meaning. But this morning, everything felt wrong. Scout, her 5-year-old German Shepherd, pressed against her legs, his muscles tense beneath his thick coat. She'd rescued him as a puppy from the animal shelter in Coeur d'Alene, and in all their years together, she'd never heard him make the low, guttural sound that now rumbled from his throat. His amber eyes remained fixed on the massive deer standing 30 yards ahead, blocking the familiar trail that led to Whispering Creek. The creature was unlike anything Rebecca had encountered in her 25 years as a forest ranger before retirement. White-tailed deer in northern Idaho typically stood about 3 feet tall at the shoulder. This one towered nearly 6 feet, its rack of antlers spreading wide enough to scrape the lower branches of the surrounding pines. Each antler point gleamed in the early morning light, sharp as spear tips. The deer's coat was the color of old copper, darker than any she'd seen, and its eyes held an intelligence that made her skin crawl. Rebecca's fingers traced the small metal markers embedded along Thomas's walking stick, tiny brass plates marking the peaks they'd climbed together, the trails they'd explored, the life they'd built in these mountains. He'd been gone 5 years now, taken by a heart attack while splitting wood behind their cabin, but she still felt his presence strongest on these morning walks. Thomas would have known what to make of this encounter. He'd always possessed an intuitive understanding of the forest that complemented her scientific training. Their cabin sat 3 miles up a logging road that most people couldn't find without GPS, nestled in a clearing surrounded by Douglas fir and western white pine. Rebecca had chosen isolation deliberately after Thomas's death, finding comfort in the rhythms of mountain life, the seasonal migrations of elk, the spring return of songbirds, the autumn rutting calls that echoed through the valleys. She knew which trails the deer used for water, where the black bears denned for winter, how the weather patterns shifted with the changing seasons. This deer violated everything she understood about wildlife behavior. Healthy deer didn't block trails and stare down humans. They bounded away at the first hint of human presence, white tails flashing as they disappeared into the undergrowth. This creature stood its ground, watching her with what seemed like deliberate intent. The wound along its left flank drew her attention again. The opening was perfectly round, about the size of a dinner plate, its edges smooth as if cut by a surgeon's blade. Through that impossible aperture, she glimpsed something that defied explanation. Not the red meat and white bone she expected, but a hollow space filled with soft, pulsing light. The illumination reminded her of foxfire, the bioluminescent fungi that sometimes glowed on rotting logs, but this light seemed alive, aware. Scout's growling intensified. Rebecca had trained him herself, drawing on knowledge gained from years of working with search and rescue dogs during her ranger career. He'd helped her track lost hikers, locate injured climbers, and once found a child who'd wandered away from a campsite. His instincts had never failed her. If Scout sensed danger, she trusted his judgment completely. "Easy, boy," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the morning breeze. "What are you trying to tell me?" The deer's ears flicked forward at the sound of her voice. Its massive head tilted slightly, and Rebecca felt the strangest sensation, as if the creature was listening, not just to her words, but to her thoughts. She'd spent enough time in the wilderness to respect the intelligence of wild animals, but this felt different. This felt like communication. A memory surfaced from her childhood visits to her grandmother's cabin, not far from where she now lived. Grandma Elena had been full of stories about the old days, tales of creatures that walked between worlds and places, where the boundary between the natural and supernatural grew thin. Rebecca had dismissed them as folklore, the kind of stories mountain people told to explain what they didn't understand. But standing here now, facing this impossible deer, those childhood tales seemed less like fantasy and more like forgotten warnings. The sound of approaching footsteps on the trail behind her broke the spell. Rebecca turned to see Silas Creek emerging from the morning mist, his daily walk timed to coincide with hers. At 78, Silas moved with the careful deliberation of a man who'd learned to respect the mountain's demands. His grandfather had been among the first white settlers in the valley, and Silas carried the accumulated wisdom of 3 generations of mountain living. "Morning, Rebecca," he called, then stopped short when he noticed Scout's aggressive posture. His gaze followed theirs to the massive deer, and his weathered face went pale. "Sweet Mary and Joseph," he breathed. "How long has it been standing there?" "Just a few minutes," Rebecca replied, not taking her eyes off the creature. "Have you ever seen anything like it?" Silas approached slowly, his own walking stick tapping against the rocky trail. He studied the deer with the intensity of a man seeing a ghost. "My grandfather used to tell stories," he said finally. "Said there were things in these mountains that didn't follow natural law. I always figured they were just tales, meant to keep children from wandering too far into the deep woods." The deer's attention shifted to Silas, and Rebecca noticed something glinting around its neck, a cord or chain of some kind, nearly hidden by its thick winter coat. Before she could get a better look, the creature took a single, deliberate step backward, then another. Without breaking eye contact, it began to retreat up the trail, moving with fluid grace despite its enormous size. "Should we follow it?" Rebecca asked, though every instinct screamed against the idea. Silas shook his head slowly. "My grandfather had a saying, 'Some invitations are best declined.' I think this might be one of those times." They watched until the deer disappeared around a bend in the trail, swallowed by the shadows between the trees. Scout's growling gradually subsided, but his muscles remained coiled, ready for action. Rebecca realized she'd been holding her breath. "What did your grandfather's stories say about creatures like that?" she asked. Silas leaned heavily on his walking stick, his blue eyes distant with memory. "He called them guardians. Said they appeared when something was about to change, when the old agreements were breaking down. Of course, he also claimed he could predict weather by watching the way his cat washed its face. So I never knew what to believe." They stood in silence for several minutes, listening to the normal sounds of the forest gradually returning, the chatter of red squirrels, the distant hammering of a woodpecker, the whisper of wind through pine needles. Whatever presence had emanated from the deer was gone, leaving behind only questions and the lingering sense that they'd witnessed something significant. "I should head back," Rebecca said finally. "Check on the cabin, make sure everything's secure," Silas nodded. "Might be wise to keep Scout close for a while. Something tells me this morning's encounter isn't the end of whatever's stirring in these mountains." As they parted ways at the fork in the trail, Rebecca found herself glancing repeatedly over her shoulder. The feeling of being watched persisted, though she saw nothing but familiar forest. Scout trotted beside her, alert and nervous, his usual eagerness for their morning walk replaced by vigilant caution. The cabin came into view through the trees, a modest structure of rough-hewn logs that Thomas had built with his own hands. Solar panels on the roof powered their basic electrical needs, and a propane generator provided backup during the long winter months. A small garden plot, dormant now in late autumn, occupied the sunny clearing beside the house. Everything looked exactly as she'd left it an hour earlier. Yet something felt different. Rebecca settled into the wooden rocking chair on the front porch, Thomas's walking stick across her knees, and tried to make sense of what she'd witnessed. In all her years of ranger work, she'd encountered bears, mountain lions, wolves, and countless other wild animals. She'd seen unusual animal behavior caused by disease, injury, or environmental stress. But nothing in her experience explained a deer that size, with that kind of intelligence, and certainly nothing explained the impossible hollow space within its body. Scout stretched out at her feet, his head resting on his paws, but his ears still pricked for any unusual sound. Rebecca scratched behind his ears, grateful for his steady presence. Whatever was happening in these mountains, she wouldn't face it alone. The morning sun climbed higher, burning off the last wisps of mist and revealing the familiar landscape she'd called home for 20 years. But now that landscape held mysteries she'd never suspected. Questions that demanded answers she wasn't sure she wanted to find. Rebecca spent the morning trying to focus on routine tasks, splitting kindling for the fireplace, organizing her pantry supplies, checking the battery levels on her solar power system, but her thoughts kept returning to the massive deer and its impossible wound. Scout remained agitated, pacing from window to window and whining softly whenever she ventured outside. By noon, she'd made her decision. "Come on, boy," she said, clipping his leash to his collar. "Let's go find some answers." The trail where they'd encountered the deer showed no obvious signs of the creature's passage. Rebecca knelt to examine the packed earth, running her fingers over ground that should have held hoofprints from something that massive. She found nothing, not even the faintest impression in the soft soil beside the path. Scout pulled against his leash, clearly reluctant to venture further up the trail. His hackles raised again as they approached the spot where the deer had vanished around the bend. Rebecca had learned to trust his instincts, but her curiosity outweighed her caution. She'd spent her career investigating unusual wildlife reports, and this was the most unusual she'd ever encountered. The trail curved through a stand of ancient Douglas firs, their trunks so massive that 3 people holding hands couldn't encircle them. Rebecca had hiked this path countless times, but today it felt different, older somehow, as if she was walking through a cathedral built by time itself. The canopy overhead filtered the afternoon sunlight into shifting patterns of gold and shadow. Scout stopped abruptly, his nose working the air. He pulled toward a cluster of huckleberry bushes off the main trail, his tail rigid with alertness. Rebecca followed, pushing through the undergrowth, and nearly stumbled over what he'd found. A leather journal lay partially hidden beneath a fallen branch, its dark brown cover cracked and weathered by exposure to the elements. The leather was soft with age, and when Rebecca picked it up, several loose pages fluttered to the ground. The binding had been torn, as if the book had been deliberately destroyed. But enough remained to reveal glimpses of faded handwriting. She gathered the scattered pages carefully, noting the yellowed paper and iron gall ink that suggested considerable age. The handwriting was cramped and urgent, with several entries crossed out so heavily they were illegible. One page caught her attention. "The old contracts are breaking down. Samuel saw 3 of them yesterday, larger than any we've recorded. The boundary stones are failing. If we cannot restore the agreement soon, there will be consequences beyond our ability to contain." The entry was dated September 15th, 1887. Rebecca turned the page. Finding more fragments, Jeremiah refuses to believe what we've witnessed. He claims there must be rational explanations for the phenomena, but I have seen the lights myself, watched the trees move without wind. The creatures grow bolder each day. They want something from us, but we have forgotten the old languages, lost the knowledge our grandfathers possessed. Scout whined and pressed against her legs. When Rebecca looked up from the journal, she noticed symbols carved into the bark of nearby trees, not random markings left by casual hikers, but deliberate signs cut deep into the living wood. The carvings formed a pattern she didn't recognize, though something about them seemed familiar, like half-remembered childhood nightmares. She photographed the symbols with her cell phone, then studied them more carefully. Each mark was precise, carved with tools rather than scratched randomly. Some appeared fresh, the sap still weeping from the cuts, while others had aged into the bark, indicating they'd been made over different time periods. Someone, or something, had been marking these trees for years. A sound made her look up, the crack of a heavy branch breaking somewhere deeper in the forest. Scout's ears perked forward, and he began pulling in the direction of the noise. Against her better judgment, Rebecca allowed him to lead her off the established trail. Following a barely visible deer path through dense undergrowth, the forest grew darker as they moved away from the main trail. The trees here were older, their trunks scarred by decades of harsh winters and forest fires. Moss hung from the branches like tattered curtains, and the air smelled of decay and deep earth. Rebecca had explored most of these mountains during her ranger years, but this area felt unfamiliar, as if the landscape itself had shifted when she wasn't looking. They emerged into a small clearing, dominated by a circle of standing stones. Rebecca stopped short, her breath catching in her throat. She'd never seen anything like this in 20 years of exploring these mountains. The stones were roughly human height, weathered granite that looked far older than any historical settlement in the region. Each monolith was carved with the same symbols she'd found on the trees, but here they were more elaborate, forming complex patterns that seemed to shift and flow as shadows moved across their surfaces. In the center of the circle lay the scattered remains of what had once been a large animal. The bones were picked clean and bleached white by weather, but they were far too big to belong to any native species. Rebecca approached cautiously, her ranger training helping her analyze what she was seeing. The skull was elongated and unfamiliar, with eye sockets that seemed too large and too knowing. The rib cage could have housed an animal the size of a horse, but the proportions were all wrong. Scout whined and backed away from the bones, his tail tucked between his legs. Rebecca knelt beside the remains, careful not to disturb them. Among the scattered bones, she found something that made her heart race, a small object that gleamed dully in the filtered sunlight. She picked it up carefully, turning it over in her palm. It was an arrowhead, but unlike any she'd seen in local museums or archaeological displays. The stone was black volcanic glass, obsidian, worked with incredible skill, into a point so sharp it could have been made yesterday. But obsidian wasn't found anywhere in northern Idaho. The nearest sources were hundreds of miles south, in the volcanic regions around Yellowstone. The journal pages rustled in her other hand, and she read another fragment. The arrows do nothing against them. Iron passes through their bodies like smoke, but they can touch us, hurt us, change us. Margaret's boy came back from the deep woods last week, but he wasn't the same child who'd wandered off. His eyes held too much knowledge, and he spoke of things that hadn't happened yet. Rebecca felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. She photographed the bone circle and the obsidian point, then carefully gathered the journal pages. Whatever she'd stumbled into was bigger than a single strange deer encounter. These artifacts suggested a history of unusual phenomena in these mountains going back over a century. A movement at the edge of the clearing caught her attention. The massive deer stood at the tree line, watching her with those impossible intelligent eyes. But now Rebecca could see what hung around its neck, a cord made of braided leather and metal, holding what appeared to be a carved stone amulet. The pendant was covered in the same symbols she'd found on the trees and standing stones. The deer took a single step into the clearing, then stopped. It lowered its massive head deliberately, touching its antlers to the ground in what seemed like a formal gesture. When it raised its head again, Rebecca saw something that made her question her sanity. The gaping wound in its side was gone. The creature's flank showed smooth, unbroken hide, the color of burnished copper. Scout pressed closer to her legs, no longer growling but still tense with alertness. The deer held Rebecca's gaze for a long moment, then turned and walked deliberately out of the clearing. But this time, instead of disappearing into the forest, it stopped at the edge of the trees and looked back at her, as if waiting. Rebecca understood. The creature wasn't threatening her, it was trying to communicate. The journal, the bone circle, the carved symbols, even the impossible wound that had healed before her eyes, they were all part of a message she didn't yet know how to read. She gathered her courage and took a step toward the deer. It waited until she was halfway across the clearing, then began walking slowly into the forest. Scout whined but followed, and Rebecca found herself being led deeper into the mountains than she'd ever ventured before, carrying a 130-year-old journal full of warnings about things that shouldn't exist. Behind them, shadows moved independently of the trees that cast them, and the symbols carved into the standing stones seemed to pulse with their own inner light. Rebecca returned to her cabin as the sun began its descent behind the western peaks, her mind reeling from what she'd discovered. The journal pages lay spread across her kitchen table, like pieces of a puzzle she didn't know how to assemble. She'd photographed every legible entry, and now she studied them under the bright LED light she used for detailed work. Scout had barely touched his dinner, preferring to maintain watch by the front door. His behavior troubled her more than she wanted to admit. In 5 years together, she'd never seen him this agitated for such an extended period. Whatever was happening in the forest, it was affecting him on an instinctual level that went beyond normal animal wariness. She made herself a cup of coffee and settled down to transcribe the journal entries. Many were too damaged to read completely, but fragments emerged that painted a disturbing picture. The Morrison boy returned today after 3 weeks missing. Claims he was cared for by the tall ones in caves beneath the mountain. His parents rejoice, but I have seen the change in his eyes. He knows things no child should know. Jeremiah's survey team found more of the large tracks near Silver Creek. The prints are deeper than any normal deer would make, and they appear to glow faintly in moonlight. Thompson swears he saw one of the creatures watching them from the ridge, but it vanished when he pointed it out to the others. The boundary stones are failing more rapidly now. 3 more have cracked this week. Elder Whitehorse says his people warned the first settlers about disturbing the old places, but we paid no heed. Now we face consequences our grandfathers set in motion. Rebecca paused at this last entry. Elder Whitehorse, that name seemed familiar. She moved to her bookshelf and pulled down a regional history book Thomas had given her years ago. After several minutes of searching, she found what she was looking for, a chapter about early interactions between white settlers and the Coeur d'Alene tribe. Chief Joseph Whitehorse had been a tribal leader in the 1880s, known for his attempts to maintain peaceful relations with incoming settlers, while preserving his people's traditional way of life. According to the historical account, he'd repeatedly warned against logging or mining in certain areas of the mountains, claiming they were sacred ground protected by ancient agreements. The white settlers had dismissed his warnings as superstition. Rebecca's phone buzzed with a text message from Silas. "Found something you need to see. Can you come by tomorrow morning?" She typed back, "What kind of something?" "The kind my grandfather made me promise never to talk about. Until now." Rebecca stared at the message. In 20 years of friendship, Silas had never mentioned family secrets. The timing couldn't be coincidental. She texted back, "I'll be there at 8. She returned to the journal pages, working by lamplight as darkness settled over the mountains. The handwriting became increasingly frantic in the later entries. They come to the edge of town now, watching from the tree line. Mrs. Patterson saw one in her garden last night, tall as a man, but with antlers like a great stag. When she called out, it turned to look at her, and she swears its eyes held human intelligence. She hasn't slept since. The agreements must be renewed. I've been studying the old papers Elder Whitehorse gave me before his death. The ceremony requires blood from both sides, human and guardian. But who among us remembers the proper words? Who can speak for our people now?" The final legible entry was dated October 31st, 1887. The barriers grow thin tonight. I go to make the attempt alone, as the others have lost their courage. If I do not return, may God forgive us for what we have unleashed upon this land. The creatures are not evil, but they are not bound by our understanding of natural law. Without the old agreements, they will do what they must to protect what is theirs. Rebecca leaned back in her chair, rubbing her tired eyes. The journal painted a picture of escalating supernatural activity in the 1880s, focused around the breakdown of some kind of ancient pact between human settlers and non-human guardians of the forest. The author had attempted some kind of ritual to restore the agreements, but the journal's abrupt end suggested he hadn't survived the attempt. She photographed the obsidian arrowhead she'd found in the bone circle, then researched similar artifacts online. The craftsmanship was exceptional, the kind of work that required decades of specialized knowledge. But more troubling was what she learned about obsidian's properties. Volcanic glass was sometimes used in ancient rituals, because it was believed to cut through the barrier between the physical and spiritual worlds. Around midnight, Scout began pacing again. He moved from window to window, whining softly and pressing his nose against the glass. Rebecca joined him at the front window and peered out into the darkness. The motion sensor light on her porch provided a small circle of illumination, but beyond that lay absolute blackness. Then she saw them, lights moving through the forest. Too steady and purposeful to be fireflies, too bright to be reflected starlight. The lights danced between the trees like living things, approaching the cabin in a slow, deliberate pattern. Scout's whining intensified, but he wasn't showing the aggressive behavior from earlier. Instead, he seemed confused, as if he couldn't decide whether the approaching lights represented danger or something else entirely. Rebecca grabbed Thomas's binoculars from the kitchen counter and focused on the nearest light. What she saw made her hands tremble. The illumination wasn't coming from a flashlight or lantern. It emanated from within, something that moved with fluid grace between the trees. She caught glimpses of tall, pale forms that seemed part human and part something else, their elongated limbs moving in ways that defied normal anatomy. The lights circled the cabin twice, staying just at the edge of the tree line. Rebecca felt no sense of menace from them, but their presence filled her with a profound unease. These weren't quite the same as the deer she'd encountered, but they were clearly related, guardians of some kind, investigating her as much as she was investigating them, after what felt like hours. The lights began to retreat into the forest. One by one, they disappeared into the depths of the mountains, leaving only darkness and the memory of impossible beings moving through her familiar world. Rebecca spent the rest of the night reading and rereading the journal entries, cross-referencing them with local historical records she could access online. A pattern began to emerge: reports of unusual wildlife behavior, unexplained disappearances, and strange lights in the mountains appeared in newspaper archives every few decades, always followed by periods of relative calm. The incidents seemed to cycle, as if something was periodically testing the boundaries between the human and natural worlds. As dawn approached, she made a decision. Whatever was happening in these mountains, it was connected to the old agreements mentioned in the journal. The deer, the lights, the carved symbols, they were all part of something larger, something that had been disrupted long ago and was now attempting to reassert itself. She needed to understand what those agreements entailed, and Silas Creek might hold the key to that understanding. His grandfather's stories, dismissed as folklore, were beginning to sound more like historical records of events the modern world had chosen to forget. Rebecca packed the journal pages carefully in a plastic folder, gathered her camera and the obsidian arrowhead, and prepared to visit her neighbor. Scout seemed calmer as morning light filled the cabin, but he stayed close to her side, as if he understood they were walking into something far more complex than a simple wildlife mystery. Silas Creek's cabin sat in a grove of ancient cedars, their massive trunks creating a natural cathedral around the modest log structure his grandfather had built in 1923. Rebecca approached the front porch with Scout at her side, noting how differently her dog behaved here compared to the previous day's encounters. Instead of the nervous alertness he'd shown in the forest, Scout seemed almost reverent, moving slowly and keeping his head low. Silas waited on his porch, but he wasn't alone. Beside him sat a weathered wooden box that Rebecca had never seen before, its surface carved with symbols that made her pulse quicken, the same patterns she'd found on the trees and standing stones. "Morning, Rebecca," Silas said, his voice carrying a gravity she'd rarely heard from him. "I see you brought the journal." Rebecca stopped short. "How did you know about—" "My grandfather told me there'd come a day when someone would find what remained of Thomas Brennan's records. He made me promise to wait, to watch, and to be ready when that day came." Silas gestured to the carved box. "He left instructions." Rebecca settled into the wooden chair across from him, her mind racing. Thomas Brennan, was he the journal's author? Schoolteacher, surveyor, and the last man in these parts who understood the old agreements. Silas opened the box with careful reverence. Inside, wrapped in oiled leather, lay several items that made Rebecca's breath catch. A compass with a silver case, its needle spinning wildly instead of pointing north. A collection of detailed maps hand-drawn on what appeared to be deer hide. And beneath everything, a leather-bound book in far better condition than the journal fragments she'd found. "Brennan was my great-great-uncle," Silas explained. "Family never talked about him much. Said he went crazy in his final years, claimed he could talk to forest spirits. But my grandfather knew different. He was one of the few who helped Brennan try to restore the boundary agreements in 1887. Rebecca lifted the compass from the box. The moment her fingers touched the silver case, the needle stopped spinning and pointed steadily toward the mountains behind Silas's cabin, the same direction the mysterious deer had led her yesterday. "What kind of agreements?" she asked. Silas opened the leather-bound book to a page marked with a strip of fabric. "The Coeur d'Alene people weren't the first inhabitants of these mountains. They found the Guardians already here, beings that existed somewhere between the animal and spirit worlds. The Guardians weren't hostile, but they weren't quite natural either. They protected certain places, maintained balances that kept the mountains stable." He showed her a map drawn in intricate detail, showing the valley system around their cabins. Certain areas were marked with symbols and connected by dotted lines that formed a complex geometric pattern across the landscape. The early white settlers wanted to log these areas, mind them establish permanent settlements. The tribal elders warned them about disturbing the sacred sites, but the settlers pressed forward anyway. That's when the Guardians began manifesting more visibly, trying to protect their territory. Rebecca studied the map, recognizing landmarks she knew well. Her own cabin sat near one of the marked areas, and the bone circle she'd discovered was clearly indicated by a symbol that looked like a stylized deer skull. Brennan was one of the few settlers who listened to Elder Whitehorse's warnings. He spent years learning about the old agreements, trying to understand how humans and Guardians had coexisted before. The agreements were essentially territorial contracts. Humans could live in certain areas and use certain resources, but they had to respect the boundaries and follow specific protocols. Silas turned to another page, showing detailed drawings of various Guardian forms. Rebecca recognized the massive deer immediately. But there were others, tall, pale figures with elongated limbs, creatures that seemed part elk and part human, beings of living light that could take animal form when needed. What happened to the agreements? Rebecca asked. They broke down in the 1880s when large-scale logging operations began. The Guardians tried to maintain the boundaries through increasingly dramatic manifestations, but the settlers interpreted these as attacks rather than warnings. Fear and misunderstanding on both sides led to a breakdown in communication. Silas's expression grew somber. Brennan attempted to restore the agreements in October 1887. He understood the ritual requirements, had learned the proper protocols from Elder Whitehorse before the chief died. But something went wrong. The ceremony required representatives from both human and Guardian sides, and Brennan went alone. He was found 3 days later at the main boundary stone, alive but just changed. Changed how? He could see things others couldn't, knew things that hadn't happened yet. My grandfather said Brennan lived the rest of his life partially in the Guardian realm, unable to fully return to the human world. He spent his remaining years documenting everything he'd learned, hoping someone else might succeed where he'd failed. Rebecca felt a chill as she remembered the journal entry about the Morrison boy returning from his disappearance with knowledge no child should possess. What happened to him eventually? He disappeared during a winter storm in 1889. Some say he finally found his way fully into the Guardian realm. Others believe he's still out there, watching and waiting for someone who can finish what he started. Silas handed her another item from the box, a small cloth bag that rattled softly when moved. Brennan collected these over several years, said they were gifts from the Guardians, proof of their willingness to restore the old relationships. Rebecca opened the bag and poured its contents into her palm. A dozen obsidian arrowheads, each carved with the same precision as the one she'd found in the bone circle. But these were different, smaller, more delicate, and warm to the touch despite the cool morning air. The Guardians have been trying to communicate again, she said, thinking of the deer's deliberate behavior and the lights around her cabin. The manifestations are increasing, Silas nodded. My grandfather told me to watch for the signs. When someone found Brennan's journal, when the Guardians began showing themselves again, when the old compass started pointing toward the deep mountains instead of magnetic north. He gestured toward the silver compass in Rebecca's hands. It's all happening now. Rebecca studied the maps more carefully, noting how the marked areas formed a network across the entire mountain range. Why me? Why am I the one finding these things? Maybe because you're the only one who lives close enough to the boundary areas and has the skills to understand what you're seeing. Maybe because the Guardians trust someone who's spent her life protecting the forest. Or maybe, Silas paused, studying her face carefully, maybe because there's something about your family connection to these mountains that you don't know yet. Before Rebecca could ask what he meant, Scout, suddenly alert, his ears pricked toward the forest behind the cabin. They all turned to look, and Rebecca saw movement among the trees. Not the massive deer this time, but something smaller and more human-like. One of the pale, elongated figures she'd glimpsed the night before stood at the edge of the clearing, watching them with obvious interest. The figure raised one impossibly long arm in what seemed like a greeting, then pointed deliberately toward the compass in Rebecca's hands. The needle spun once, then locked onto a new direction, deeper into the mountains than either of them had ever traveled. I think, Silas said quietly. They're ready to try again. The pale figure at the forest edge held Rebecca's attention for a long moment before disappearing into the shadows. But its message was clear. The compass pointed towards something important, and the Guardians expected her to follow. I'm coming with you, Silas said firmly, reading the resolve in her expression. Rebecca started to object, but he raised a weathered hand. My grandfather made me promise to help when this day arrived. Besides, you'll need someone who remembers the old stories, and I might be the last person in these mountains who knows them properly. They spent the rest of the morning preparing for a journey into unmapped territory. Rebecca gathered her essential gear, first aid supplies, water purification tablets, energy bars, and an emergency blanket. Silas collected items from his grandfather's collection, a leather pouch containing what he called offering stones, and a thick wool blanket that he claimed had been blessed by Elder Whitehorse. Scout seemed more energetic than he'd been since the encounters began, his tail wagging as he watched their preparations. Whatever awaited them, he was ready to face it by their side. The compass led them along an animal path that diverged from the established trail system, winding through dense stands of old-growth timber. Rebecca knew this general area from her ranger years, but she'd never explored this specific route. The path showed heavy use despite its remote location, suggesting frequent traffic by something larger than typical wildlife. 2 hours of steady climbing brought them to a plateau scattered with natural springs. The atmosphere here felt charged with energy that made Rebecca's skin tingle. Scout moved with careful attention to his surroundings, nose constantly testing the air. But he showed none of the previous day's anxiety. "We're approaching something significant," Silas observed, checking Brennan's hand-drawn map. "This area is marked as a convergence point, where multiple boundary lines meet. They discovered the first carved symbol near the largest spring. Cut deep into a massive cedar's trunk, the wood around it had darkened with age. Unlike the symbols Rebecca had photographed earlier, this one seemed to emit a faint luminescence when viewed directly. "Come look at this," Rebecca called, kneeling beside stones arranged in a deliberate pattern around the spring's perimeter. Among the carefully positioned rocks, something caught the filtered sunlight, a small object that made her pulse quicken. A whistle lay among the stones, carved from polished bone and decorated with tiny symbols that matched those they'd found throughout the forest. When Rebecca picked it up, the instrument felt warm against her skin, as if recently used. "The craftsmanship isn't Native American," Silas said, examining it closely. "The style seems older, like it predates known human cultures in this region." Rebecca studied how naturally the whistle fit her grip. Almost without thinking, she brought it to her lips and produced a soft, experimental note. The sound was unlike anything she'd heard. Neither purely musical nor animal call, but something that seemed to harmonize with the forest itself. The response came immediately. From the surrounding woods, answering calls arose. Not echoes, but intentional replies, ranging from deep, resonant tones to crystalline notes that suggested creatures beyond her imagination. Scout's ears perked forward, but rather than showing alarm, he wagged his tail and gazed expectantly toward the tree line. "I believe you just announced our arrival," Silas said, his voice mixing wonder with apprehension. They didn't wait long for visitors. The massive deer emerged from the forest with its characteristic fluid movement. This time, 2 companions accompanied it, beings nearly human in height, but with elk-like proportions and elongated limbs that moved in perfect coordination. Their coats displayed an opalescent quality that shifted colors as they moved through the dappled light. The deer approached the spring and lowered its antlered head to drink. When it lifted its crown again, water droplets sparkled like diamonds in the sunlight. It focused on Rebecca with that disturbingly intelligent gaze, and produced a sound she hadn't heard before, a low, musical tone that seemed to resonate through her entire body. Rebecca felt compelled to respond. Raising the bone whistle, she attempted to match the deer's vocalization. Her attempt was clumsy compared to the creature's sophisticated sounds, but she sensed she was achieving basic communication. The deer's ears moved forward, and it repeated the same tone, but softer and more patient. "It's teaching you," Silas whispered, "like a language lesson." For the next hour, Rebecca practiced with the whistle while the 3 guardian creatures waited patiently beside the spring. Gradually, she began recognizing that different note combinations carried distinct meanings. Rising tones seemed to indicate questions, while falling tones suggested agreement or acknowledgement. Complex melodic patterns conveyed emotions she couldn't fully translate, but that felt like concepts of protection, ancient wisdom, and something resembling hope. The elk-like beings eventually approached with the same measured deliberation as the deer. One, which Rebecca somehow recognized as female, extended her graceful neck toward the whistle. When Rebecca offered it, the creature breathed softly across its surface, and the bone grew noticeably warmer, while Rebecca continued her faltering conversation with the guardians. Silas consulted Brennan's documentation. According to these notes, the whistle serves as more than a communication tool. Brennan describes instruments of covenant, objects that create connections between human and guardian realms. Responding to his words, the deer moved closer to Rebecca. The stone amulet around its neck glowed with gentle light. The creature lowered its massive head, bringing the pendant within reach. At close range, She could see it was carved from the same material as the obsidian arrowheads, but worked into intricate patterns that seemed to shift and flow like living designs. The deer produced a specific sequence of sounds, and Rebecca tried to replicate them with the whistle. When she achieved a reasonable approximation, the creature gently touched her shoulder with its muzzle, then stepped back and gestured with its head toward the deeper mountains. "They want us to follow them," Rebecca said, as understanding dawned. "To witness something important." Silas carefully packed Brennan's materials. "My grandfather always predicted this day would come. He said that when the Guardians were ready to trust humans again, they would select someone to restore the old relationships." As they prepared to follow the creatures into the wilderness, Rebecca felt the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders. She was no longer simply investigating unusual wildlife behavior. She was participating in something that could determine the future relationship between human civilization and powers far older than recorded history. The Guardians led them away from the spring toward mountain, regions that appeared on no contemporary maps, where the very air seemed heavy with ancient mysteries waiting to be revealed. The Guardians led them through terrain that seemed to exist outside normal geography. Paths appeared where none had been moments before, and the landscape itself seemed to shift subtly when Rebecca wasn't looking directly at it. The compass spun wildly now, unable to find magnetic north in a place where natural laws operated differently. After an hour of careful hiking, they emerged into a valley that took Rebecca's breath away. Ancient trees rose like cathedral pillars around a natural amphitheater, their trunks so massive they dwarfed even the old-growth giants she'd known throughout her ranger career. At the valley's heart lay a series of terraced pools, fed by underground springs, each level carved from living rock and connected by channels that formed intricate patterns when viewed from above. But what captured Rebecca's attention weren't the natural wonders. It was the evidence of deliberate cultivation throughout the valley. Gardens of plants she didn't recognize grew in careful arrangements, their leaves and flowers bearing the same luminescent quality she'd noticed in the Guardians themselves. Structures that weren't quite buildings and weren't quite natural formations dotted the landscape, formed from woven branches and living stone that seemed to grow rather than be constructed. "This is impossible," Silas breathed, consulting Brennan's maps. "This valley isn't shown on any survey, and I've lived in these mountains my entire life." The deer led them to the largest of the terraced pools, where Rebecca discovered something that challenged everything she thought she knew about the region's geology. Growing from the pool's rocky edges were clusters of crystals, unlike anything she'd seen in nature, translucent formations that pulsed with soft, warm light and emanated a gentle humming sound when the wind passed through them. One of the elk-like Guardians approached the crystal formation and touched a specific cluster with its muzzle. Immediately the humming intensified and the crystals began to glow more brightly. Rebecca felt a corresponding vibration in the bone whistle she carried, as if it was resonating with the same energy source. The crystals are connected to the boundary system, Silas realized, studying Brennan's detailed notes. According to this, they mark places where the barrier between the human and Guardian realms grows thin. When the crystals are healthy and properly maintained, the boundaries remain stable. Rebecca approached the formation carefully, noting how the light patterns shifted as she moved. When she extended her hand toward the largest cluster, warmth emanated from the crystals without any actual heat, a sensation like sunlight filtered through deep water. The moment her fingers made contact with the smooth surface, images flooded her mind. She saw the valley as it had been centuries ago, filled with both human and Guardian inhabitants living in careful harmony. She witnessed the first white settlers arriving, their fear and misunderstanding leading to the breakdown of ancient agreements. She experienced the Guardians' attempts to communicate, their growing desperation as the boundaries weakened and their realm began to collapse. Most disturbing were the recent images, the crystals dimming as nearby logging operations disrupted the energy flows, wildlife fleeing as their habitats were destroyed. and the Guardians themselves beginning to fade as their connection to the physical world weakened. "They're dying," Rebecca whispered, tears streaming down her face. "The entire Guardian realm is collapsing because the boundaries aren't being maintained." The deer made a complex series of sounds, and Rebecca instinctively raised the bone whistle to respond. To her surprise, she found she could now understand much more of the communication. The creature was explaining that the crystals required regular care from both human and Guardian representatives, a responsibility that had been abandoned. When the old agreements broke down, Silas pulled out his cell phone to document what they were seeing. But the device wouldn't function properly in the valley. The screen flickered with interference patterns, and the GPS showed their location as a blank void. "We're in a place that doesn't quite exist in normal space," he observed. The female elk guardian approached Rebecca and made a sound that felt like a question. When Rebecca attempted to respond with the whistle, the creature extended her neck and gently touched the instrument with her nose. Suddenly, Rebecca's understanding expanded dramatically. She could sense the Guardian's thoughts directly, feeling emotions and concepts that had no human equivalent. The Guardian's name was something like Song of Deep Waters, and she was ancient, beyond human comprehension. She remembered when the first humans had arrived in the mountains, frightened and struggling to survive in an unfamiliar landscape. The Guardians had chosen to help them, teaching them which plants were safe to eat, where to find shelter during harsh winters, how to live with the land rather than against it. The original agreements had been established through generations of careful negotiation, creating a system where humans could thrive while the Guardian realm remained protected. But the newer settlers had brought different ideas about land ownership and resource exploitation, ideas that couldn't accommodate the existence of non-human intelligence. Song of Deep Waters showed Rebecca images of the current crisis. Logging operations had already begun on the valley's eastern edge, though the workers couldn't see the Guardian realm directly. Their equipment was disrupting the energy flows that sustained the crystal formations, causing them to dim and crack. Without intervention, the entire system would collapse within months, leaving the Guardians with no choice but to retreat permanently from the physical world. "What do they need from us?" Rebecca asked aloud, though she was beginning to understand the answer even as she spoke. The deer approached and touched the stone amulet around its neck to one of the larger crystals. Light flowed between them, and Rebecca saw a vision of the restoration ceremony that Thomas Brennan had attempted. The ritual required specific actions at precise locations throughout the boundary system, coordinated efforts from both human and Guardian participants, and most critically, a human representative willing to accept partial responsibility for maintaining the agreements. "It's not just about restoring the old boundaries," Silas said, his voice filled with awe as he began to understand the scope of what was being asked. "They want to establish a new covenant, one that takes modern human civilization into account while protecting the Guardian realm." Rebecca felt the weight of the decision before her. Accepting the role would mean committing herself to regular journeys into the Guardian realm, learning their languages and customs, serving as a bridge between two very different forms of consciousness. It would mean keeping secrets from the outside world and dedicating much of her remaining life to responsibilities most people would consider fantasy. But as she looked around the dying valley, at the dimming crystals and the desperate hope in the Guardian's ancient eyes, she realized she'd already made her choice. The moment she'd decided to follow the massive deer into the deep forest. She'd started down a path that led inevitably to this moment. Song of Deep Waters made a sound that Rebecca now understood was an expression of gratitude mixed with hope. The Guardian could sense her decision even before Rebecca spoke it aloud. "Tell me what I need to do," Rebecca said, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was accepting. "Show me how to help." Song of Deep Waters led them to a section of the valley Rebecca hadn't noticed before, where ancient stone formations rose from the earth like the ribs of some enormous buried creature. Between these natural monuments stood structures that were unmistakably human in origin: stone, foundations and carved markers that spoke of permanent settlement rather than temporary camps. "These aren't Native American," Silas said, running his hands over precisely cut stone blocks. "The construction techniques are different, older." Rebecca studied the carvings more carefully. Among the symbols she now recognized as Guardian language, she found others that looked disturbingly familiar. Names and dates carved in English, but from decades before any recorded white settlement in the region. And then she saw something that made her blood freeze. Elena Torres, Guardian and Keeper, 1923-1987. Her grandmother's name, carved in stone in a place that supposedly didn't exist. "That's impossible," Rebecca whispered. But even as she spoke, memories began surfacing. Childhood visits to Grandma Elena's cabin. Stories about forest friends that Rebecca had dismissed as fairy tales. The old woman's uncanny ability to predict weather and find lost objects. Elena's cabin had been only a few miles from where Rebecca now lived. Built on land that had been in the family for 3 generations, Song of Deep Waters approached the stone marker and made a complex sound that the bone whistle helped Rebecca interpret as something like honored ancestor or beloved guardian. The elk guardian touched the carved name gently with her muzzle, then looked directly at Rebecca with an expression that could only be described as recognition. "Your grandmother was the last active guardian," Silas said, understanding dawning in his voice. "That's why you're here, why the Guardians are trusting you. It's not coincidence, it's inheritance." Rebecca's legs gave out and she sat heavily on one of the stone blocks. Everything about her life suddenly took on new meaning. Her childhood moved to the mountains after her parents' deaths. Elena's insistence that Rebecca learn to listen to the forest, the old woman's detailed knowledge of plant, medicines and animal behavior that went far beyond what most mountain dwellers possessed. The deer approached and lowered its great head, touching Rebecca's shoulder gently. Through their growing connection, she felt a flood of memories that weren't her own. Elena as a young woman, learning the Guardian languages from Song of Deep Waters and others, participating in the boundary maintenance rituals, serving as translator and mediator between the human and Guardian worlds. "She never told me," Rebecca said, tears streaming down her face. "All those years, and she never said a word about this." Song of Deep Waters made a sound that conveyed deep sadness and understanding. Through their connection, Rebecca learned that Eleanor had hoped to pass the knowledge and responsibility to Rebecca gradually over many years. But Elena's unexpected death from a stroke had left the Guardians without a human representative. At a critical time when logging and development pressures were intensifying, the Guardians have been waiting for you to discover your heritage. Naturally, Silas realized. That's why they've been manifesting more dramatically lately. They're running out of time. But they needed you to choose this path willingly. Rebecca moved to examine more of the stone foundations, finding evidence that her family's connection to this place went back further than she'd ever imagined. Names carved in stone told the story. Miguel Torres, first keeper, 1847-1889. Maria Santos Torres, healer and guardian, 1889-1923. A lineage of guardians stretching back to the original agreements, each generation accepting responsibility for maintaining the balance between human and supernatural worlds. But the most shocking discovery came when she found a more recent carving, one that made her question everything she thought she knew about her own life. Rebecca Elena Torres, chosen guardian, awaiting awakening. The inscription was dated 15 years ago, 5 years before Elena's death, and long before Rebecca had any conscious awareness of the Guardian Realm's existence. "They've been watching me my entire life," Rebecca said, the full implications starting to sink in. "My move to this specific cabin, my career as a forest ranger, even my decision to stay here after Thomas died, none of it was coincidence." Song of Deep Waters confirmed what Rebecca was beginning to understand. The Guardians had been subtly influencing events to ensure she would be in the right place when the crisis reached its peak. Her ranger training had prepared her to navigate the wilderness safely and understand ecological relationships. Her isolation after Thomas's death had freed her from obligations that might prevent her from accepting Guardian responsibilities. Even Scout's presence was part of the larger plan. Guardian dogs had always served alongside human keepers, their enhanced senses helping to monitor the boundary systems. The deer led them to the center of the stone circle, where Rebecca found the most important artifact yet, a carved stone tablet set into a raised platform. The tablet bore an intricate map of the entire mountain range, showing not just the physical geography, but the network of energy lines that connected all the boundary points. And at several key locations, the map showed planned disruptions, logging operations, mining surveys, and development projects that would destroy critical crystal formations within the next few months. This isn't just about maintaining old agreements, Rebecca realized with growing horror. Someone knows about the Guardian realm and is deliberately trying to destroy it. Silas examined the tablet more carefully, his expression darkening. Some of these locations are marked with corporate logos: Cascade Timber, Mountain Peak Mining, Northern Development Corporation. These aren't random projects. This is a coordinated assault on the boundary system. Song of Deep Waters shared images that made Rebecca's stomach churn. Meetings between corporate executives and government officials who clearly understood exactly what they were destroying. Maps showing the exact locations of Guardian settlements. Scientific equipment designed to detect and disrupt the energy patterns that sustained the crystal formations. There's a group of humans who've known about the Guardians for decades, Rebecca said. The pieces falling into place. They've been planning this systematically, waiting for the right moment when there was no active human guardian to protect the boundaries. The deer made a sound that conveyed urgent warning. Through their connection, Rebecca learned that the logging operations weren't just threatening the valley. They were scheduled to begin cutting in the crystal formations within days. Once those anchor points were destroyed, the entire Guardian realm would collapse irreversibly. We have to stop them, Rebecca said, but even as she spoke, she realized the enormity of what they were facing. How could 3 people and a handful of supernatural beings stop major corporations backed by government approval and millions of dollars in equipment? Song of Deep Waters touched the tablet with her muzzle, and new sections of the map began to glow. Rebecca saw that the Guardian realm wasn't isolated to this valley. It was part of a vast network stretching across multiple mountain ranges, connected to similar Guardian communities throughout the Pacific Northwest. If the collapse began here, it would spread like a chain reaction, destroying supernatural ecosystems that had existed for thousands of years. But the map also showed something else. Other locations where the boundaries remained strong, other valleys where Guardian communities still thrived. And in some of those places, the map indicated human Guardians who were still active, still maintaining their ancestral responsibilities. We're not alone, Rebecca said, hope beginning to replace despair. There are others like my grandmother, others who've kept the old agreements alive. The deer touched the amulet around its neck to the tablet, and suddenly Rebecca could sense them, human Guardians scattered across the region, each one maintaining their section of the boundary network. She felt their surprise and relief as they sensed her awakening, their eagerness to share knowledge and coordinate efforts. Eleanor prepared for this, Silas said, studying the tablet's intricate details. She knew the attack was coming, and she made sure you'd be ready when the time came. That's why she left you the cabin where you did, why she made sure you'd develop the skills you'd need. Rebecca stood up, decision crystallizing in her mind. The corporate conspiracy to destroy the Guardian realm was massive and well-funded, but it was also vulnerable. It depended on secrecy and the absence of human opposition. With active Guardians coordinating resistance and the Guardians themselves able to defend their territory directly, the outcome wasn't predetermined. Show me how to contact the other Guardians, she said to Song of Deep Waters. and teach me everything I need to know about the boundary maintenance rituals. If they want a fight, we'll give them one. The next 3 days passed in a blur of intensive preparation that challenged every assumption Rebecca had ever held about the natural world. Song of Deep Waters and the other guardians proved to be patient but demanding teachers, guiding her through the complex rituals required to maintain the boundary systems while simultaneously connecting her with human guardians. Across the Pacific Northwest, through the bone whistle and her growing psychic connection to the guardian realm, Rebecca found herself in communication with 7 other active keepers. An elderly Makah woman in coastal Washington who maintained the ocean boundaries, a retired logger in Oregon whose family had protected old-growth groves for 4 generations, and others scattered across the mountain ranges. Each had preserved their section of the ancient network, waiting for the day when they might need to coordinate their efforts. Dr. James Whitfield arrived on the 2nd day, though his presence in the valley surprised Rebecca until she learned the truth about his research. Far from being a random wildlife biologist, he represented a group of scientists who had been documenting guardian phenomena for decades, carefully building evidence that might someday be used to protect the supernatural ecosystems from exploitation. We've been expecting this crisis for 20 years, he explained as they studied the corporate documents Song of Deep Waters had somehow obtained. The logging and mining companies have been quietly mapping the boundary points, using ground-penetrating radar and magnetic anomaly detectors to locate the crystal formations. They know exactly what they're destroying. The documents revealed the scope of the conspiracy with chilling clarity. Cascade Timber had purchased mineral and logging rights to over 30,000 acres in the heart of the Guardian Realm, including the hidden valley where they now sat. Mountain Peak Mining had obtained permits to explore for rare earth elements that existed only in the crystalline formations that anchored the boundary system. Northern Development Corporation planned to build a resort complex directly on top of the most significant Guardian settlement in the region. They're not just after the resources, Dr. Whitfield said, pointing to scientific reports included in the corporate files. They understand that the Guardian realm represents a form of consciousness and energy that doesn't fit their model of reality. Eliminating it removes a significant obstacle to total environmental exploitation. Rebecca felt her anger building as she read through the deliberate deceptions and legal manipulations that had made the assault possible. Environmental impact statements that ignored obvious signs of supernatural activity. Cultural surveys that dismissed Guardian artifacts as anomalous Native American. Remains of unclear significance permit. Applications that use technical language to hide the true scope of the planned destruction. But the most infuriating discovery came when she found her own name mentioned in the corporate communications. They'd been watching her since Elena's death, waiting to ensure that no new Guardian would emerge before beginning their operations. Her isolation after Thomas's death had been seen as confirmation that the Guardian lineage was broken. They made one critical error, Silas observed, studying the timeline of planned operations. They assumed that without active human Guardians, the supernatural inhabitants would be unable to organize effective resistance. They didn't account for the possibility that the Guardians themselves might take direct action. Song of Deep Waters had been working with her counterparts throughout the region to prepare exactly such a response. Through their network, Rebecca learned that Guardian communities possessed capabilities that went far beyond what she'd witnessed so far. They could influence weather patterns, communicate with and direct wildlife, and when necessary, directly interfere with human technology and equipment. The plan that emerged over those 3 days was both elegant and audacious. While the human Guardians worked to legally challenge the most critical permits and gather evidence of corporate malfeasance, the supernatural Guardians would use their abilities to protect the most vulnerable boundary points. Simultaneously, Rebecca would perform the restoration ceremony that Thomas Brennan had failed to complete, strengthening the entire network and making it more resistant to disruption. but the ceremony required artifacts that had been scattered over the decades since the original agreements collapsed. Elena had hidden the Guardian's staff somewhere in the mountains before her death, leaving only cryptic clues about its location. Other ritual items were scattered among the Guardian communities, requiring coordination and trust between groups that had been isolated from each other for generations. Rebecca found herself transformed by the intensive training. The bone whistle had become an extension of her consciousness, allowing her to communicate not just with individual Guardians, but with the entire network simultaneously. She could sense the health of crystal formations throughout the region, feel the stress patterns in the boundary system, and monitor the approach of the corporate crews with their destructive equipment. Scout proved invaluable during the preparation, his enhanced senses allowing him to locate hidden artifacts and detect subtle changes in the Guardian realm's energy patterns. More importantly, he served as an anchor to her human identity as Rebecca's consciousness expanded to encompass perspectives that sometimes threatened to overwhelm her merely human awareness. The ceremony has to be performed at the moment of greatest threat. Song of Deep Waters explained through their psychic connection. The ritual draws its power from the tension between preservation and destruction, requiring the Guardian network to be fully activated in response to immediate danger. Dr. Whitfield coordinated the human response, using his scientific credentials to raise questions about the environmental impact assessments, while discreetly documenting Guardian phenomena that might eventually support legal challenges. Other human Guardians began subtle sabotage operations, using their local knowledge to slow down equipment deliveries and create bureaucratic delays. But they all knew that the real confrontation would come when the logging crews reached the hidden valley. The corporate schedule showed that operation beginning at dawn on the fourth day, with crews planning to clear-cut the forests surrounding the crystal formations before beginning mineral extraction. On the night before the ceremony, Rebecca made her way to the highest point in the valley, where ancient stones formed a natural observatory. The moon was dark, but the crystal formations provided enough light to read by, their pulsing illumination creating a rhythm that seemed to match her heartbeat. Elena's journal, the real one, not the fragments Thomas Brennan had left behind, lay open in her lap. Song of Deep Waters had revealed its hiding place in a cave system that existed partially outside normal space, accessible only to those with Guardian blood. The journal contained Elena's detailed records of her guardianship, including her preparations for the crisis they now faced. My dear granddaughter, the final entry read, "If you are reading this, then the time has come for you to accept the responsibility I could not prepare you for directly. The corporations have been patient, but their assault on the Guardian realm will come soon after my death. You have been trained for this moment your entire life, though you may not have realized it. Trust the Guardians, trust your instincts, and remember that the old agreements were never about domination. They were about partnership between all forms of consciousness that call these mountains home." Below Elena's words, in handwriting Rebecca recognized as Thomas Brennan's, was a final message. The ceremony requires sacrifice, but not of life, of isolation. To serve as Guardian is to accept that you will never again be fully human or fully Guardian, but something between. Consider carefully whether you can bear this burden. Rebecca closed the journal and looked out over the valley where Guardian lights moved between the trees in preparation for tomorrow's confrontation. She thought about her quiet life before the deer's appearance, her plans for a peaceful retirement in the mountains, the simple routines that had structured her days since Thomas's death. All of that would end tomorrow. Whether the ceremony succeeded or failed, she could never return to ignorance of the Guardian realm's existence. She would spend the rest of her life serving as a bridge between two worlds, carrying responsibilities that most humans couldn't comprehend, and secrets that could never be fully shared. But as she watched Song of Deep Waters approach through the moonlit forest, flanked by dozens of other Guardians gathering for the final confrontation, Rebecca felt a sense of purpose that had been missing from her life since Thomas's death. Elena had been right. She had been prepared for this moment through every choice she'd made, every skill she'd developed, every quiet year spent learning to listen to the forest's voice. "Tomorrow we find out if we're strong enough," she told Scout, who pressed against her side with steady loyalty. "Either we save this place, or we go down fighting for something worth protecting." Dawn was only hours away, and with it would come the greatest challenge the Guardian realm had faced in over a century. Rebecca gathered the ritual implements around her and began the preliminary meditations that would prepare her consciousness for the ceremony ahead. The fate of an entire hidden world would soon rest in her hands. The sound of chainsaws reached the hidden valley just before dawn. Their mechanical roar, a violent intrusion in the sacred space that had known only natural sounds for centuries. Rebecca stood in the center of the stone circle, surrounded by the 7 ritual stones that Song of Deep Waters had helped her align according to the precise pattern shown in Elena's journal. Each stone hummed with energy, connected to boundary points throughout the mountain range where other human guardians were simultaneously performing their parts of the ceremony. Through the bone whistle, Rebecca could sense their presence, the Maka woman on the coast beginning the ocean ritual, the Oregon logger activating the old-growth protections, and others across the network adding their power to the collective effort. Scout paced the circle's perimeter, his hackles raised but his behavior controlled. The guardian dogs had their own role in the ceremony, serving as anchors to ensure their human partners didn't lose themselves completely in the supernatural energies they were channeling. The massive deer stood at the valley's eastern edge, where the sound of destruction grew closer with each passing minute. Its antlers caught the first rays of sunlight filtering through the canopy, and Rebecca could see tension in every line of its powerful body. Song of Deep Waters and dozens of other guardians had taken positions throughout the forest, ready to defend their realm through methods that would challenge human understanding of natural law. Dr. Whitfield's voice crackled through the radio clipped to Rebecca's belt. "The legal injunctions are in place, but the crews are ignoring them. They're cutting through the outer perimeter now, about half a mile from your position. I've documented everything for the court challenges. But we need to buy more time." Rebecca raised the bone whistle to her lips and began the opening sequence that Elena's journal had described in meticulous detail. The notes that emerged weren't quite music and weren't quite speech, but something that resonated with the deepest frequencies of the earth itself. The crystal formations throughout the valley responded immediately, their light intensifying until the entire space glowed with ethereal illumination. The ritual required precise timing and absolute focus. As Rebecca played the opening movements, she felt her consciousness expanding beyond the boundaries of her individual mind. Through the Guardian network, she experienced the ceremony's effects across hundreds of square miles, boundary stones awakening from decades of dormancy, crystal formations pulsing with renewed energy, Guardian communities emerging from hiding to take active roles in protecting their territories, but the corporate crews weren't retreating. Through Song of Deep Waters' enhanced senses, Rebecca witnessed the destruction approaching the valley's edge. Massive trees that had stood for centuries fell under the assault of industrial equipment, their death cries echoing through the Guardian realm like screams of agony. The deer made a sound that required no translation, a call to battle that resonated through every Guardian in the region. Rebecca watched in awe as the forest itself began to respond. Trees that had seemed passive suddenly became active participants in their own defense. Branches reaching out to entangle machinery, roots rising from the earth to trip advancing workers. Wildlife poured from the deep woods in numbers that defied natural population densities. Bears emerged from hibernation weeks early, wolves appeared where none had been seen for decades, and eagles circled overhead in formations that blocked out the sun. But these weren't ordinary animals. They moved with the coordinated purpose of a military unit. each species playing its role in a defense strategy that transcended individual survival instincts. The chainsaw sounds stopped abruptly, replaced by shouts of confusion and fear from the logging crews. Through Dr. Whitfield's radio, Rebecca heard the panic in their voices as equipment mysteriously failed and familiar forest paths suddenly led in, directions that made no geographical sense. "The compasses are spinning," came a voice through the static. "GPS shows us in 3 different locations simultaneously. And the trees, something's wrong with the trees. They're moving when there's no wind." Rebecca felt the first phase of the ritual reaching completion as the Guardian network fully activated. The boundary system that had been weakening for decades suddenly surged with power, creating a protective barrier around the most sacred sites that would be virtually impossible for the corporate crews to penetrate. But she could sense that Song of Deep Waters and the other Guardians were paying a terrible price for this direct confrontation with human technology. Each act of supernatural intervention drained energy from beings who had already been weakened by years of boundary degradation. The deer's magnificent form seemed somehow diminished, and several of the smaller Guardians had already retreated deeper into the valley to conserve their remaining strength. The ceremony was working, but it wasn't enough. The corporate assault was too massive, too well-funded and legally protected to be stopped by confusion and equipment failures alone. Rebecca realized that the second phase of the ritual, the part that required her to risk everything, had become inevitable. Rebecca moved to the heart of the stone circle, where the largest crystal formation pulsed with light that seemed to come from the Earth's core itself. This was the moment Eleanor's journal had warned her about, the point where she would have to choose between her human limitations and the boundless responsibilities of full guardianship. The heart of the forest, as Song of Deep Waters called it, was more than just a crystal. It was the focal point of all guardian energy in the region, a living conduit between the physical and supernatural worlds that required a conscious mind to channel its power safely. Touch it, and she would gain the ability to permanently restore the boundary network. But the contact would also bind her consciousness to the Guardian realm in ways that could never be undone. Scout whined and pressed against her legs, somehow sensing the magnitude of what she was about to attempt. Rebecca knelt and scratched behind his ears, drawing comfort from his steady presence. "If this goes wrong," she whispered to him, "find Dr. Whitfield. He'll take care of you." The radio crackled with urgent voices as the logging crews regrouped for another assault. Corporate supervisors were demanding that their workers ignore the natural phenomena and continue with their assignments. Heavy equipment was being brought in from other sites, and she heard references to unconventional extraction methods that made her blood run cold. Through the Guardian network, Rebecca felt Song of Deep Waters approaching the moment of complete exhaustion. The deer's efforts to coordinate the forest's defense were consuming the last of her ancient strength. Without immediate intervention, the Guardian realm's most powerful protector would fade permanently from the physical world. Rebecca placed her hands on the heart of the forest. The crystal's surface was warm as living skin, and the moment her palms made contact, energy surged through her body with an intensity that threatened to stop her heart. She felt her consciousness exploding outward, suddenly aware of every Guardian, every crystal formation, every boundary stone across thousands of square miles of wilderness. But more than awareness, she gained the ability to act through the entire network simultaneously. Through her expanded consciousness, Rebecca reached out to every piece of corporate equipment threatening the Guardian realm. Chainsaws died as their engines seized. Bulldozers sank into ground that became inexplicably soft beneath their weight. Trucks found their GPS systems leading them in, endless circles through forest roads that rearranged themselves with each turn. The boundary stones that had been cracking and failing for decades suddenly blazed with renewed power, creating an invisible barrier that confused and disoriented anyone approaching with destructive intent. The crystal formations throughout the region synchronized their energy output, establishing a harmonic resonance that would strengthen the Guardian realm for generations to come. But the effort was consuming Rebecca's human identity like fire consuming dry wood. She felt herself beginning to dissolve into the vast network of Guardian consciousness, her individual thoughts and memories becoming indistinguishable from the collective. Awareness of beings who had existed since the mountains themselves were young. Scouts. Bach penetrated the overwhelming cascade of sensation, his familiar voice serving as an anchor to her human self. Through their bond, she felt his absolute loyalty and trust, his certainty that she would find her way back to him no matter how far her consciousness traveled. Using that connection as a lifeline, Rebecca began the delicate process of withdrawing from full merger with the heart of the forest, while maintaining enough contact to complete the boundary restoration. The technique required her to exist simultaneously in human and Guardian awareness, a state that Elena's journal had described as walking between worlds. The sensation was indescribable. Part of her consciousness remained firmly rooted in her physical body, aware of Scout's warmth against her legs and the cold mountain air on her skin. But another part of her awareness now extended permanently throughout the Guardian network, able to monitor the boundary system's health and respond to future threats with supernatural abilities. Through this dual consciousness, Rebecca witnessed the logging crew's final retreat. Faced with equipment failures they couldn't explain and forest conditions that violated every natural law they understood. The corporate supervisors were forced to suspend operations pending further environmental assessment. Dr. Whitfield's legal challenges suddenly had teeth, backed by documented evidence of phenomena that demanded scientific investigation. Song of Deep Waters approached the stone circle, her magnificent form now radiating renewed vitality as the restored boundary network channeled fresh energy through her ancient being. The deer's eyes met Rebecca's, and in that moment, Rebecca understood that she had succeeded beyond her greatest hopes. The Guardian realm was not only protected, it was stronger than it had been in over a century. The network of boundary stones and crystal formations now formed an integrated system that could adapt to future threats while maintaining the delicate balance between human civilization and supernatural wilderness. But the victory had come at the cost Rebecca had always known it would require. She was no longer fully human, no longer capable of living a simple, isolated life in her mountain cabin. She was now the bridge between worlds that Elena had been before her, carrying responsibilities that would shape the rest of her existence. As the immediate crisis passed, Rebecca slowly withdrew her hands from the heart of the forest, her consciousness settling into its new configuration. She was still herself, but she was also something more, a guardian of ancient agreements, a protector of realms that existed beyond ordinary human perception. 6 months later, Rebecca stood in the morning sunlight outside her cabin, watching Scout chase a squirrel through the undergrowth with the boundless enthusiasm of a dog who understood that the forest was once again safe. The legal battles had taken months to resolve, but Dr. Whitfield's documentation of the unusual environmental phenomena had ultimately led to the entire region being designated as a protected wilderness area, effectively ending any possibility of future corporate exploitation. The transformation in Rebecca's daily life had been profound, but not unwelcome. Her enhanced awareness allowed her to monitor the health of Guardian communities across the Pacific Northwest, and she found deep satisfaction in maintaining the boundary network that kept both human and supernatural worlds in balance. The responsibility was enormous, but it was also purposeful in ways her retirement had never been. Silas Creek arrived for their weekly meeting, carrying the leather satchel that contained his grandfather's records and the growing collection of documents they'd assembled about Guardian communities throughout North America. Their research had revealed that the network extended far beyond the Pacific Northwest, with active Guardians maintaining ancient agreements in locations from the Appalachian Mountains to the Canadian Rockies. "Letter from the Maca Guardian," Silas said. settling into the rocking chair beside hers on the front porch. The coastal boundaries are stronger than they've been in decades. She's found 3 new families willing to learn the traditional protocols. Rebecca smiled, feeling the truth of those words through her connection to the network. The successful defense of the Hidden Valley had inspired guardians throughout the region to emerge from hiding and begin training new keepers. The ancient agreements were not only restored but expanding, as more humans learned to work with the supernatural inhabitants of wild places. Dr. Whitfield's quarterly report lay open on her lap, documenting the remarkable ecological recovery that had followed the boundary restoration. Wildlife populations in the protected areas were thriving beyond all scientific predictions, and several species thought to be locally extinct had mysteriously reappeared. The crystal formations were now growing larger and more numerous, creating new anchor points for the boundary system that would ensure its stability for generations to come. But the most significant change was in Rebecca herself. The woman who had once lived in quiet isolation now served as a hub of communication between guardian communities, coordinating responses to environmental threats and helping to negotiate new agreements as human. Civilization continued to expand into previously wild territories. Scout bounded up the porch steps and settled at her feet, his coat gleaming with health and his eyes bright with intelligence that went beyond normal canine awareness. The guardian dogs had been affected by the boundary restoration as well, developing enhanced abilities that made them even more effective partners for their human companions. "Sometimes I wonder what Thomas would think of all this," Rebecca said, her fingers tracing the metal markers on his old walking stick. "He always said the mountains held more secrets than most people suspected," Silas chuckled. "Something tells me he knew more than he let on. That cabin of yours sits awfully close to the main boundary line for the location to be coincidental." Rebecca had wondered about that herself. In the month since the ceremony, she'd discovered several artifacts hidden around her property, carved stones and metal markers that suggested Thomas had been aware of the Guardian Realm's existence, even if he'd never spoken of it directly. Perhaps he'd been preparing her for this responsibility without either of them fully understanding what was coming. A movement at the forest edge caught her attention, and she smiled as Song of Deep Waters emerged from the trees. The deer's daily visits had become a cherished routine, a time for sharing information about the network's status and planning responses to new challenges. But more than that, they had become genuine friendship between beings who existed in different realms but shared common purpose. The deer approached the porch and made the soft sound that Rebecca now understood as a greeting of deep affection. Through their connection, she felt Song of Deep Waters' contentment with the way the Guardian Realm had stabilized and grown stronger. The ancient being's form was more solid now, her presence in the physical world no longer dependent on desperate measures to maintain failing boundaries. "The new seedling is growing well," Rebecca said aloud, knowing that Song of Deep Waters would understand the reference. Where Rebecca's blood had touched the earth during the ceremony, a small tree had sprouted, not quite any species known to science, but something that bridged the gap between ordinary flora and the living light of the Guardian Realm. Dr. Whitfield was fascinated by the plant's unique properties, and several universities had expressed interest in studying it once it matured. As the sun climbed higher, Rebecca prepared for her weekly journey into the Hidden Valley, where she would perform the maintenance rituals that kept the boundary network operating smoothly. It was work that required both her human knowledge and her guardian abilities, a perfect synthesis of the two worlds she now inhabited. Scout rose eagerly as she gathered her pack, and Song of Deep Waters stepped back to give them room to pass. The deer would accompany them as always, serving as guide and protector during their travels through realms that existed beyond ordinary geography. Standing on her porch, looking out over mountains that held wonders most humans never suspected, Rebecca felt a profound sense of completion. She had found her true calling in life, discovered purposes that gave meaning to every day and connected her to something far greater than her individual existence. The forest called to her with voices that sang of ancient agreements renewed and futures bright with possibility. Rebecca shouldered her pack, clicked her tongue for Scout to follow, and stepped off the porch into a world where the boundary between natural and supernatural had been restored to its proper balance. Behind them, the metal markers on Thomas's walking stick caught the morning light, each small brass plate reflecting the sun like tiny beacons, marking the trail they had traveled together to reach this moment of peace.